as this is happening, as the Supreme Court is releasing the major ruling on the Second Amendment, you also have a major development in federal gun legislation. For the first time in decades, you're getting new gun restrictions. It's not the first federal gun law, right? I know you've written about this, so the way media has covered this, but it's the first time we have new restrictions. And frankly, the bill hasn't technically passed yet, but it's extremely likely to happen before the July 4th recess here that's coming up. And, it's the first one that has new restrictions, and that could apply to a lot of people, honestly, given the way the bill is written. And the fact that it extends the current prohibitions on selling guns to somebody who has a felony conviction, a domestic violence misdemeanor, or has been involuntarily committed. It extends all those things to that person, to anyone's juvenile records in as well as their adult records. So that, I don't know how many people, I'm sure there's no way to really know for sure how many people that's going to make newly prohibited. But it's probably a lot, right?
Yeah. So I backing up a bit, I don't think this law is very good.
Yes, you've been critical. You've written a number of pieces at National Review on this. So yeah, can you just give us your overarching view of why you don't think this deal is a good idea?
Well, I first off don't think it's a deal. I think it's a series of concessions, and I wish Republicans would stop calling it a deal. A deal would be where both sides had got something they wanted, rather than one side getting some of what it wanted. There are changes to the law that Republicans want. For example, they'd like to fix the Firearms Owners Protection Act. They'd like to take suppressors out of the NFA. They're never going to get something massive like concealed carry reciprocity, which I should say I have a constitutional issue with, which we won't go into now. But they could have got something around the edges that really would not have undermined what the Democrats are trying to do. They didn't. This isn't a deal. It's a concession.
Well, one, I guess, just to challenge you real quick on that point, they did get, funding for school safety programs and funding for mental health crisis interventions, which has been priorities for Republicans and even, groups like the NRA as, solutions to mass shootings. But you don't view that as there isn't any program.
I don't. Right? I don't, because I think that while the Republicans are the people who have said we need to make schools safer, I don't think it was ever necessarily the product of federal funding. That was their idea as to how they could do it. But schools are a state concern. I've never heard a Republican say, the way that we should fix this is to harden our schools, and it has to be with federal money. This is really a state question. So the way I see this bill, I think there's sort of three categories. One are ideas that really do belong to the states. Two is ideas that are actually already in federal law and are weirdly reiterated. And three is good federal ideas that are the federal government's job, but just don't seem to have been particularly well thought through. So in the first category, you have all sorts of money for what are really state concerns. You have money for red flag laws, money for mental health, money for hardening schools. I don't think that's the role of the federal government. I don't like the federal government spending money when it doesn't have any left. I don't like the federal government sending money to the states on average, because it adds all sorts of riders to the money that interferes with state prerogatives. So I don't think there was a need for federal money here. I don't think any state in the union has declined to implement a red flag system because they thought it would cost too much. To me, this is federal intrusion. Then there's the second part, which baffles me, the redefinition of an FFL in ways that aren't particularly transparent. And the reiteration that straw purchasing is illegal, which we already knew is already federal law. The problem there is that we just don't enforce it either at the state or federal level. Right. And then there's the federal bits. Now, the federal bits, I actually have some time for in theory. I don't have a problem with the federal government trying to work out how to improve the background check system in the way it currently exists. And I don't have a problem with expanding definitions of domestic violence to try and prevent people from getting hold of guns and then shooting their spouse or girlfriend or what you will. It's just that I don't think these provisions have been really thought through. First, there is a weird provision in that which expands the definition of domestic violence convict of a misdemeanor, of course, because felons are already prohibited, to those with girlfriends, essentially who are in a long-term or serious relationship.
Dating partners, yes.
But then expires it after 5 years. Now, firstly, I'm not clear why we would do that, But if we believe that after, say, 5 years, people who've committed violent crimes are or should be eligible to buy guns again, I mean, maybe we should have a conversation much more broadly about that, because that's not the way we treat anyone else. If you rob a bank, we don't give you 5 years and then give you a gun back. It's weird.
It's an odd provision because it expunges the record after 5 years only for domestic violence misdemeanors committed by people who against their dating partners, which one, also, they don't really define what a dating partner is. They have some vague guidelines about it, dealing with the length of the relationship and the nature of they don't really specifically say any of like how long the relationship has to be, or it's real. A lot is left up to, I guess, the courts to figure out. But yeah, anyone who is found to be in this category of somebody who's committed a domestic violence misdemeanor against a dating partner, their record is automatically expunged from NICS, the National Institute of Criminal Background Check System, after 5 years if they don't recommit a crime or break probation or anything like that. And it is odd because it does not apply to any of the other domestic violence misdemeanor convictions or any of the other prohibiting records for some reason. Even the juvenile records don't. So they have sort of two things that are separate that are smushed together when it comes to juveniles. Or young, adults under 21. There's the juvenile records thing, which adds all felony and domestic violence misdemeanor and involuntary commitment records, juvenile records, to the NICS system. And then there's a special background check process just for 18 to 20-year-olds, which really kind of, it seems like in practice it would automatically, or in the vast majority of cases, put somebody into a delay process where the FBI gets 3 days to investigate whether there are red flags, whether there's some reason to think you might have a disqualifying record, and then gets 10 days total to look for that record before the sale can process without a decision. But the background check process goes away after 10 years, but the records don't. They all stay in the system.
Well, this is another part that I'm confused by. And I think, as with the so-called boyfriend loophole, which we just discussed, it's the product of a total lack of debate. This has been written in private. It's being rushed through. So if it is a good idea to include juvenile records, for example, and I'm open to the idea that it is, we should have had a much longer conversation about this, because the way that states treat juvenile records really varies dramatically. Some of them automatically expunge those records. Some of them allow them into court. The federal government is about to preempt 50 states on juvenile records question and include them in the background check system when evaluating eligibility for a constitutional right. And it's just going to do it in a week. I'm no fan of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but she does have a point on this, that this has far-reaching consequences, and we just haven't talked about it at all. Also, the inclusion of juvenile records, which apply to everyone irrespective of their age, so 18 to 20 and also 21 and above, seems to me to be a bit of a problem, because the law only amends purchasing. Yes. It doesn't amend possession. Now, is that a mistake? It could be. This was written really quickly. If it's not, what is it trying to achieve?
It's very odd.
If the idea is to prevent people who have juvenile records, because they're presumably dangerous, from having guns and hurting people with them, then do you not want to make it illegal for them to possess those guns too? So we're what? We're going to have a lifetime ban on buying a gun if you have a juvenile record,
on selling
obtained at any age, but not, on buying a gun or selling someone, but not owning one.
Yeah, it's not even, you could legally... Someone with a prohibiting juvenile record under this bill could legally try to buy one. The onus isn't on the person with the record. It's the onus is on the seller. There's a knowingly standard in there. So, it's not just, you'd have to have some reason to think the person was prohibited, but But yeah, I mean, it's very odd the way it's written. I imagine that's a mistake because, like, why would you do it that way? Like, I mean, it's not a grandfathering, right? It doesn't.
No, we don't do it anywhere else either.
Yeah, it's just a very odd thing. And then yeah, the changing the definition of FFL is, or engaged in the business in order to, you know, require somebody to obtain a license seems, the language appears to be just as vague as the previous language, except for the requirement that somebody be trying to make a livelihood off of the gun sales. That's in the previous definition. Now it's just that they're predominantly trying to profit, which opens up the idea that maybe anyone selling a gun for profit at any point.
Yeah.
Might
and I have to say, the reason this bothers me, Stephen, is that the interpretation of the previous provision is clear. Whether or not the previous provision is clear to the average person reading it, we now have 29 years of case law on what that provision means. I mean, this is obviously the product of the Brady bill, because you have to determine who has to run a background check and who doesn't, and the 1968 Gun Control Act. And so those two have intersected for 29 years, and we have a fairly good idea what it means. And the Democrats want to change it. They want to change it with so-called universal background checks too, but they also at various points have tried to change or clarify or massage what it means to be in the business. Obama tried to do this over and over again, and they've run up against a brick wall because that law has been fairly stable. And now in a bill that no one has really read or debated, suddenly it's being changed. I'm not saying there's some grand conspiracy here, but I think that makes it very difficult for people who are trying to comply with the law to feel comfortable selling a gun. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I had a bunch of guns that I didn't want anymore, and I thought maybe I'll go down to a gun show and I'll sell one, or maybe I'll sell one on Craigslist, and I would now worry that some court's going to come along and say, well, this, what looks like a semantic change is actually a really important change, and you're going to federal prison.
Yeah.
I don't think we should be changing the law like that.
I think that's a real risk of this language change. I mean, I sold a gun and made a profit off it once. I'd built an AR, and the demand for ARs went way up in 2013, if you recall, because of concern that they were going to become banned. And I made money when I sold that AR. Under this new standard, would I be breaking the law? I don't know.
Right.
There was some speculation that they were finally going to put like a number on how many sales you could do before you needed to get a license, but it doesn't do that. It's just equally as vague as the other one, except it seems to remove the livelihood requirement. At least it removes livelihood from the definition of engaged in the business, which sounds like a lower standard to me now.
Right.
Right. I would be pretty worried that the ATF could just, go after anyone who's selling a gun and makes a profit off of it in any circumstance. I don't know. We don't know. That's the problem.